Hello friends, my name is Emily, I'm the bi, and here are some books and a game or two based off those books off of my bookshelf. Obviously I talk a lot about books, I talk a fair amount about TV and film on this channel. One of the things I never talk about on this channel that I really love are board games, but specifically today I wanted to talk about a kind of branch of board games, which are RPGs. And I've played a couple of them. My favorite, and I think a lot of people's favorite, at least for right now, is D&D. So today I thought I would talk a little bit about both history of D&D and kind of a good place to start if you just kind of want to see what D&D is about, whether you want to play it eventually or just kind of want to consume the stories that are being told through D&D. D&D is, and RPGs in general, are a really unique way of storytelling because it really is an improv session and a lot of really cool stuff can happen and they're just so much fun. Or they can be so much fun. They can also be kind of a slog depending on who you're playing with and kind of what you're doing in the story of the campaign. But I thought I would talk about kind of the reasons I love D&D and the kind of base of D&D as a whole today. So I actually did a episode, or at least half of an episode because that's how the episodes worked, of Emily and Megan are Fandom Laureates, which is a podcast about fandom that Megan and I used to do, which has since completed and I will put a link down below. We talked a lot about a bunch of different things, but one of the things that I did was D&D. So I talked about the history of D&D and kind of the cultural impact of D&D, which by the way is a lot. So if you like fantasy, or if you don't like fantasy and you want to do other things, D&D is still good for that. Anyway, so here's a little history of D&D. Extremely cliff noted. So in 1974, Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, which is a company, published the first books, although they were really just kind of pamphlets, not really books the way we imagine books today in role-playing, for the first modern role-playing game, which was D&D. This is first edition, is happening. It was created by Gary Gygax, who was a big war game person, which is similar but distinctly different, and Dave Arneson, who eventually was kind of bought out of TSR and like bought out of the company. So Gary Gygax is kind of considered to be the main guy for D&D, but Arneson really contributed in a way that I think we can't really ignore, despite all of the very, very intense neurodrama, which by the way is just like my favorite thing. If I was ever gonna make a biopic or like a biopic miniseries about the creation of something, the Social Network style, I want it to be D&D because shit, this stuff is wild. Anyway, so Gygax and Arneson create D&D. It's kind of based off of a little bit of war games and kind of how war games is played and like how people imagine war games, but it's also based off of Lord of the Rings and a bunch of really famous popular fantasy books and media that kind of existed at the time when it was created in the 70s. So Gygax is also the creator of a convention that I am dying to go to, which is now known as Gen Con, which is a board game and RPG gaming convention that, please God, I really want to go to at some point. It sounds so up my alley, but it's where a lot of kind of RPG stuff is unveiled for the first time, especially like D&D, because it's the tabletop board gaming convention, and wow, I really want to go to that. So basically, Gygax ends up creating TSR because nobody else will publish the rules that Arneson and him have created for what will eventually become D&D. Everyone's like, no thanks. I'm good. Like all the major gaming publishers at the time who like would publish war game campaigns and war game rules, and like they're like, this is up your alley, and they're like, no thanks, we don't want that. So they end up creating TSR, or he ends up creating TSR with an investor so that they can just self-publish the rules to D&D. Also during the 70s, when Basic and AD&D are happening, like late 70s, is when kind of satanic panic is taking hold, so D&D gets kind of brought into that because of some kids who are playing pranks and go missing and all kinds of stuff where D&D is kind of implicated, even though, you know, that seems okay, yeah, cool. So eventually Gygax ends up leaving TSR for various reasons, but he can't publish D&D because TSR are the company that owns the rights to D&D. But eventually TSR ends up being sold in 1997 to Wizards of the Coast, who in 1993 had created Magic the Gathering, the card game, which had outsold all of the RPGs on the market, including D&D. So TSR was like, yeah, you can have it, that's fine. In 1997, it was sold, and it was soon after that basically 3rd edition, 4th edition, and the current edition that we use, 5th edition, were published sequentially by Wizards of the Coast. So in 2012, they announced that 5th edition was coming, and they playtested it for 2 to 2.5 years, and then it eventually came out in 2014, 2015, where it kind of became the standard. Everyone moved on to 5th edition. 5th edition is considered by many people to be extremely user-friendly. It's very like good for people who have never played D&D. They essentially deleted, sort of, like they went back to zero and went, what makes it accessible? And so 5th edition is considered to be the most accessible version of D&D, which is why I think it is an extremely good place to start. It's where I started. I've never played any other edition of D&D, though I have played other role-playing games. They all function kind of differently, but D&D is classic. And 5th edition is going to be the edition that you learn, and generally if you consume any of the D&D media other than kind of one of the big things, which I'll talk about in a little bit, they're all running 5th edition. So if you're interested in D&D and like the mechanics of D&D, that's the edition that you want to look for. That's the edition that you want to learn. So let's get to the book of the matter. There are core books in D&D. This is true in every edition of D&D, but these happen to be the 3 core books for 5th edition. Now, it is very important that you know that you don't actually need to buy any of the core books in order to learn or to start playing D&D, because Wizards of the Coast actually has all of the basic rules published online, so you can access them for free and start playing without actually owning any of the material that would like teach you how to play, because it's online. Now, that doesn't mean the whole of the player's handbook is online. You can definitely find it, but it is not free publicly online from Wizards of the Coast. But enough of it is free that you can learn how to play. And enough websites have kind of a general guide of everything that exists in both the core handbooks and in the supplemental books that you could probably get away with not buying anything. In fact, you also don't actually need to buy dice, which is the thing that people associate with D&D the most. Because there are a lot of online rollers, Wizards of the Coast has their own digital roller, so you could literally play D&D without buying anything at all, which I think is very important. Okay, so the core books for 5th edition are the Player's Handbook, which has all of the base rules. It has the extremely basic sets of classes and races, spells, weapons, all that kind of stuff. There are some other supplemental books that kind of expand and give you more options for different things, but this is going to be like your main base. So in D&D, when you're making a character, you're going to pick 2 things about that character that kind of define what stuff you get and what kind of abilities you can do. So you're going to pick your race, which includes like human and elf and dragonborn and like all those kinds of things. The other thing you're going to pick is your class, which is basically what's your job? How do you move through the world? How do you fight? Do you use magic? Do you use weapons? What kind of weapons? What kind of magic? That's going to be stuff like, are you a druid? Are you a ranger, which are like archers? Are you a fighter? Are you a monk? Are you a paladin, wizard? That kind of stuff. So those are the 2 big things you're going to pick, and then the Player's Handbook or whatever you're looking at will basically be like, okay, here are your features for your race. You usually don't get that many. And then your class is going to be the big thing. So it's like, okay, here are your class features. When you're at this level, you get this, and you can kind of decide where you want to put your ability points and therefore where you get your bonuses from, and do all of that based on what kind of character you're going to play. Because there are 6 scores that you can move around while you're making a character that kind of determine, are you smart? Are you strong? Do you have a good constitution? That kind of stuff. And based on whatever class you're playing, certain things will require you to have a better ability score in certain things so that you roll higher. You get a better bonus to your roll. Slightly complicated, but not actually that complicated. The other 2 core books include the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is what it says on the tin. This is for people who want to actually run the game. This is how you do it. This is how you handle players, how you handle monsters. It teaches you about combat. It teaches you about basically answers to questions players might have, answers to things you've always had, how to deal with stuff like chases, or how to build armies, or all that kind of stuff. And then the other book in the core books is the monster manual. So essentially, if you never want to run a game, this is the only book you ever want. You don't need the other two books. However, if you want to run a game, you need these ones too. So this is how do you do the thing, and this is how do you control the monsters. What kinds of monsters, what are their abilities, what are their ability scores, what are their, features, what can they do? And this is a book of essentially all of the main monsters that you will find in general campaigns. There are more supplemental books for the monster manual, just like there are more supplemental books that kind of add stuff to the player's handbook. So these are the base books for those supplemental materials. So the other thing you're gonna find when you're starting with D&D, or when you're thinking about starting with D&D, is you're gonna find starter sets. So there's like a classic D&D starter set, which I don't own, but I do own the D&D starter set for Stranger Things, because this is who I am. And I actually ran my first game of D&D running this for my friend Daniel's birthday. He's one of the players that I play with. I've been friends with him since I moved to LA, and I've been playing D&D with him since I started playing D&D. And I wanted to kind of see if I liked running a game. So this is the game we ran. It was really fucking fun. So in a starter set, you will find a set of die, which I have not opened yet. This particular starter set came with figurines, which we don't use in our game. We have not gotten there yet, but it came with some. It came with an already painted Demogorgon and a non-painted Demogorgon if you wanted to paint it yourself. Maybe one day I will do that. They also all come with starter rule sets. So this is the overview of what you need to know as a person who's playing. It also has some of the DM rules so that if you're looking at it as the DM, you know what's going on. So this is kind of essentially, I think, the thing that Wizards of the Coast has published free online is essentially the starter rule kit. The other things that you'll find with a starter set are going to be the adventure book. So this one, it looks like Mike's adventure book because you're playing the D&D campaign that they're playing in Stranger Things, not necessarily a Stranger Things themed game, just to be clear about this particular starter set. But you'll find for the DM, the adventure book. Here's what happens, here's where you are, here are some things that will happen to your players. Comes with this is very important. So finally, the last thing you'll get in a starter set are pre-made character sheets. Basically, you can hand these to your players as a new DM, and they don't have to make a character. You don't have to go through the very long process of making a character. And then if you decide that you actually want to make characters, or you want to make characters for the next campaign, but you're a little wishy-washy on how to do it, you can look at the character sheets that are pre-made and official and kind of compare it to what you're doing. Try to reverse engineer what Wizards of the Coast did here. So those are starter sets. There's a couple of them. There's definitely a Rick and Morty one that just came out that I'm dying to get because that sounds fun. But there's also just a general regular looking D&D starter set. I think they're about 25 or 30 bucks instead of having to pay, 35 or 40 bucks. I'm sorry, these are 50. They're cheaper on Amazon though. So if you're gonna buy the D&D books, you can either buy them digitally, really cheap, or you can buy them online on Amazon for 25 or 30 bucks instead of 50, which is wild. That's if you want to play D&D. I also have a bunch of sets of die. I guess I have 3 because I actually forgot about the Stranger Things ones. But if you're still unsure if you want to play D&D, but you want to kind of look at some media of stories people have already done, I have a couple of suggestions. There are 3 big pieces of media for D&D. There are definitely way more, but the 3 big ones, at least, that were big enough on my radar for me to go, what's going on over there? And then I ended up playing D&D eventually anyway. So the McElroy brothers plus their dad Clint have a podcast called The Adventure Zone. It is extremely good. It is on, I believe, the 3rd major campaign. The first 2 were DM'd by Griffin, and the current one is being DM'd by Travis. And they're just a lot of fun, very emotional and funny storytelling. They're following 5th edition rules, but I think this is probably the most accessible of all of the D&D RPG style podcasts or shows or whatever that I'm gonna suggest today. So one of the reasons I think it is so accessible is because, and you can hear this in the first episode, Griffin, as the DM of the first campaign, and second, basically decided at the beginning, because they were playing 5th edition while it was still being play tested. So they were sent 5th edition. So that's kind of weird when you're listening to the podcast, is you're like, oh, interesting. 5th edition's already out, but this is wild because they're talking about stuff that technically wasn't officially public yet, or like officially out in the public yet. But then it eventually comes out and it's fine. So that's kind of interesting. But one of the big things is that Griffin kind of streamlined the stuff that he knew his brothers and his dad and the audience would or wouldn't care about. So they're not really worrying about food, they're not worrying about water. Sometimes in campaigns that stuff is really important, but for the story that Griffin ends up telling, it's not. So he's not worried about it. He's not worried if people have rations or if they have enough water in their water skins. Some DMs are intense about it, or if they have enough like crossbow bolts or whatever. Like, Griffin doesn't care about that. A lot of DMs do, and that's fine, but that's why I think that this is such an accessible point, because it can then be a thing that you care about layered on top of understanding what's going on. Another thing that I think makes it accessible but is kind of frustrating because it means you can never play the adventures is that these are stories that Griffin has made specifically for his brothers and his dad. And these are adventures that are definitely meant to play to an audience, but they're a little messy in terms of if he were to write an adventure book for it, it's just never going to exist, and that's fine. So one of the things that I think makes the Adventure Zone significantly more kind of accessible than the other two big things I'm going to talk about, even though I think they are also accessible, is that at the beginning, Griffin, who is an entertainer and has had a podcast with his brothers for a very long time by this point when the show starts, understands what is interesting both to an audience and what is going to be interesting to his brothers and his dad while they're actually playing. But I think the focus on what is interesting and kind of what will keep the attention of audience members who maybe don't care as much about the technical aspect of D&D, and there's a lot of technical aspect that if you wanted to watch people be extremely technical with D&D and like watch the whole process, you could, and it would be fine. And there are lots of shows and live streams that do that, but because Griffin was very conscious of the fact that they wanted to kind of have it be more of a storytelling podcast that happened to use D&D as the storytelling method rather than just like specifically a D&D technical podcast, I think it makes it much more accessible if you're just kind of looking to see like, I don't know, is this D&D thing a thing I might be interested in? Listen to the Adventure Zone. Or better yet, you can read the Adventure Zone. So the Adventure Zone has since been turned into a comic. These are the first two, the third one is coming out soon. These are kind of legs of the adventure from the beginning. So you have number 1, which is Here There Be Gerblins. And then you have number 2, which is Murder on the Rockport Limited, which is a train heist story. What I think is so fascinating about Here There Be Gerblins versus Murder on the Rockport Limited and the rest of the Adventure Zone is that Here There Be Gerblins is essentially, until the very end, the starter set. The guys start in Fandom, they kind of travel around, they're trying to do something. Fandom is the town that the starter set starts all the characters in. And then Griffin changed it. And then he went into his own story. And so it is and isn't the normal world of D&D, which I love. And I think makes it maybe more accessible to the outside world. I don't know if that's true, but I love it. And if you think you might like D&D, or if you like fantasy and you want a significantly more storytelling, non-technical, or not as technical anyway, version in D&D to kind of see if you like D&D at all, the Adventure Zone is the thing for you. The next thing I'm going to suggest is Critical Role. This is a very long-running D&D game between Matt Mercer and a bunch of voice actors. It's both technical and also very much the nerdy improv, and they're all voice actors, so it's excellent. Very, very good. What's neat about Critical Role is if you decide to start watching Critical Role or listening to it and then get very into it, you can play in Matt Mercer's world because he has published an official D&D campaign book, which is something that I don't think the McElroy brothers are ever going to do. In fact, Griffin has talked about this because he was coming up with the Amnesty arc kind of on the fly and figuring out what was working and wasn't working for his brothers and his dad. It's definitely a thing that I don't think will ever end up being a campaign that you can actually play. You could probably recreate it, but it's never going to be an official campaign. The other RPG thing that I want to talk about that I think is like a good in is Harmon Quest. So I say it's a good in, not because it is D&D, because technically it is not D&D. It is Pathfinder, which is a different system. I think they ended up doing Pathfinder both because the GM, Game Master instead of Dungeon Master, who is running Dan Harmon's game and has been running it since it was just on Harmontown, his original podcast and live show, is more comfortable in Pathfinder. And while I think that they originally ran what became Harmon Quest, their like weekly D&D game, on Harmontown in D&D, I think when they made it its own show, they decided to use Pathfinder for a couple of reasons, one of which is that Spencer, the GM, really kind of simplifies the rules and he does all the rolling, and I think this is a good entry point as well for that reason. It's really not as technical as, say, Critical Role or any of the other podcasts. I would say it's actually even less technical than the Adventure Zone, so if you're looking for something that's D&D adjacent, because it's still an RPG, but isn't D&D, Harmon Quest is a great place to start. It also has a little animation in it, so it's fun to watch, and everyone's extremely funny. It's Dan Harmon's show, by the way. Dan Harmon is the guy who created Community and a bunch of other stuff, including Rick and Morty, which is why it's kind of fun that there's a Rick and Morty starter set. Neat. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is that there are a couple of official D&D board games, card games, etc. that aren't related to using them in play. So like there's a bunch of cards that you can use for D&D if you're playing pen and paper. I'm not talking about those, although those are extremely cool, super useful. I am talking about actual games that are D&D but also aren't D&D. And the thing I wanted to talk about more than anything else, because I think it is my favorite and we've played a couple of them, is Dungeon Mayhem. So this is the full set. I have the original game and I have both of the expansions. This is the second expansion where you can play as monsters. So this is basically a card game where you're playing as a character. You basically have an entire deck of actions. You have an entire deck of either attacks or spells or whatever, and you have a certain number in your hand and you're trying to attack and kill everybody else in the game. It's great. It's super fun. It's fast. It can get very contentious. So contentious. And the base game has 4 characters originally, and then the first expansion added 2 more, and then the new expansion, which is this big old box, added I think like 6 more, but it added monsters. So you can play as a gelatinous cube, or I think a dragon, or a mimic, a beholder, a mind flayer. You can play as an owlbear. Very cool. So I think that this is a really good kind of super fun expansion of D&D. You don't need to know anything about D&D to play this game. It's kind of just like cool, fun fantasy. It is D&D. It is officially licensed Wizards of the Coast D&D, but you don't need to know anything about D&D to play it. And if you do know stuff about D&D or you're an active D&D player, the little nods are just kind of fun. And that's kind of it about D&D. We're still in 5th edition. I don't know if we're ever going to go into 6th edition or, well, I'm sure we will, but it won't be anytime soon, I think. I think everyone's pretty settled into 5th edition. So if you think D&D is maybe something you're interested in either playing or just like looking at stories people have played, then my suggestions are The Adventure Zone, Harmon Quest, and Critical Role. There are also a bunch of other podcasts or live streams that exist for D&D specifically, or other systems like Vampire the Masquerade or Pathfinder or Cyberpunk, which started as a tabletop RPG and is now going to be a very kick-ass game whenever it comes out. D&D is great, RPGs are great, you should go and play one. Or at least listen/watch people play one, because it's very good, super unique storytelling. Oh, actually, I did have one more thing. I started watching and I 110% recommend him because he is really soothing to watch. He is like a wealth of knowledge and soothing, non-patronizing, very cool, is Matt Colville. I will link him down below. He has been DMing since like the 70s, basically since he was a teenager and D&D started, and he works at a gaming company and he runs a bunch of games. He DMs all the time, and he has a series for people who want to become dungeon masters to kind of make their experience and make the experience they're giving their players even better. And I've been very slowly making my way through it, and it's just fascinating. It's also just very cool to watch as a person who is a player who doesn't really DM that much but maybe wants to. But even if you don't want to DM, his series called Running the Game, which I will link the playlist to down below, is so good. Extremely good. So Matt Colville, add him to your list. He's just like a wealth of knowledge. He also has live streams and stuff so you can watch him play. But if you're interested in the technical aspects of D&D, he is a good guy to look into. Matt Colville, good dude.